Welcome to In His Grip with Dr. Chuck F. Betters, produced by Mark Inc. Ministries. Each In His Grip message is designed to help turn our hearts toward Jesus and equip us to walk by faith. Let's join Dr. Betters in the sanctuary as he preaches the series, Midwives of the Messiah.
Jeremiah 17:9 says, "The heart is deceitful above all things," and I like what Jeremiah says, "and beyond cure." Do you see your heart that way, as beyond cure? The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it, Jeremiah says. Or the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 7 and verse 18 says, "I know that nothing good lives in me. That is in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. Not I will not carry it out, I cannot carry it out." It's not only a matter of will, it's a matter of ability. We neither have the will nor the ability because the heart is beyond cure. Yet a man regenerated by the power of God's love, even though saved, even though the guilt of the sin is removed, is still capable of incredible degrees of evil. We see that in the story of this man after God's own heart and the woman whose life he impacted and infected. The flesh of the believer and the flesh in the non-believer have both been infected from the very same disease, the fall of Adam. My heart and the unbeliever's heart have both been infected by the very same sin disease. Our great hero, the writer of sacred song, we call the Psalms, most of them, the lad who in faith slew a giant, has now fallen prey to the lusts of his own heart. In fact, there are two books in Samuel that represent the rise and the fall of this man after God's own heart. We watch him as he slays Goliath, and we watch him as he descends into the pit of incredible sin and depravity with his great sin against Bathsheba. David cast off all fellowship with God. He forgets the power of God's mighty acts, mighty victories over his enemies. He abandons sweet communion with the Spirit. He sheds his own conscience, and he chooses to run in a race that will ruin the abundance of his own soul for the rest of his life, just for one fleeting moment to feed the lusts of his fallen flesh. Someone has said that every claim that God had upon him, every obligation of the high office, all the fences divine mercy had built to protect him were ruthlessly trampled underfoot by the fiery lusts now burning within him. This is a series of messages, the third in this series, that I've entitled 5 Women God Used to Shape Christmas. We find their stories vividly recorded for us in Scripture. We've talked about Tamar, we've talked about Rahab, and now we're going to talk about Bathsheba. All of these women God used to shape Christmas. All of these women, we find their names in the genealogy of Jesus. Something quite extraordinary, given the fact that most women's names would not appear in a genealogy. But we see these women and their stories brought out before us, laid there for us to look at, laid there for us to examine in graphic detail. Now let me raise a point as we get into 2 Samuel chapter 11 that I hope it's clear to you as we unfold this passage. It would be so easy for us to spend this time talking about David's sin. It would be very easy and very tempting, and we must do that to some degree. Focus on what David did. David was the king. David was the spiritual leader of the nation. David was the man after God's own heart. David was the one God raised up as king over Israel. David was the man whose lineage would breed Messiah. And so it's very easy for us when we read 2 Samuel 11 to focus on what David did. You know the story. You've heard it from the time you were in Sunday school. How David viewed this woman, saw her at a time of the day when he should have been somewhere else, taking a bath. He lusted after her and plotted a strategy in which he could have this woman. The problem was this woman was married to a very loyal soldier of David's, one who would literally give his life and eventually did give his life for David. Not only does David commit the sin of adultery, but David also commits the sin of murder. And in this massive political cover-up, we have all of the story told in graphic detail, showing us exactly what took place, what was going on in his heart, what was going on in everyone else's heart. And as we read the story, it's very easy to skip over something. There was a woman involved. And this act of David's impacted her life as well. We tend to focus so much on David that we forget that David's sin also infected this woman, Bathsheba. Now, there are a few things we know about Bathsheba that we'll talk about in just a moment, but let me make the point and then let's go to the scripture. The most vulnerable time in our spiritual journey, I found this true in my life, and I think it's probably true in most of our lives. The most vulnerable time spiritually that we have when we're on our spiritual journey, the most vulnerable time for moral failure is either right on the heels of or in the wake of some great spiritual victory. God's either preparing us for something or we have just come through something in which we have experienced the power of God in our lives. David and his armies have just defeated the enemy as winter set in. They would take a break from the war during this winter time, but just before that break, just before their siege on this final outpost of the Ammonites, just before this took place, 40,000 enemy troops were killed by David's armies, plus 700, or depending on which passage you read and depending on how it's properly interpreted, 7,000 charioteers, the elite guard, if you will. Now, that's a lot of people. We've lost, 3,000 plus soldiers in Iraq? We lost close to 50,000 in Vietnam. There were well over 500,000, I believe, killed in World War II. Here is a seemingly ancient war, an ancient battle in which 40,000 people died. So David is coming off of this massive victory, and spring comes. It's time for chapter 2. It's time for David's army to go back in and finish the job. They left the enemy locked up in this isolated city, and the final blow had yet to be dealt. And they were about to do that when spring came. Now, David has experienced this incredible victory, and it's almost as though God is saying, watch out. He's setting the stage. On the heels of great spiritual victory, we are most vulnerable for moral failure. But let me make one further point that really I want us to focus on as we go through this message. We can also be in great danger spiritually when we are connected to someone, when we have a relationship with someone, when we are intimately involved with someone, a deep, close relationship, friendship, even a marital relationship, we are also in great peril and potentially great danger when we are with someone who has just come through great spiritual victory or is about to experience great spiritual victory. Such is the case with Bathsheba. I believe what we have here is a woman from a human perspective. Obviously, from a divine perspective, it's going to prove to be different. But from a human perspective, we have a woman here who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, getting involved with the wrong man. And that decision would affect her for the rest of her life. It would also impact David's household for the rest of his life. Look at 2 Samuel 11, beginning with verse 1. In the spring, and this is important, this next phrase, at the time when kings go off to war. Well, that ought to give you a clue as to something's wrong right now. Something's wrong with this picture right now. David was where David should not have been. He needed to be where Joab was. He needed to be where his general was, knocking on the door of the enemy, leading the war, standing there giving leadership to the troops as they are about to embark on the mopping up project. Well, where was David? David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. He sent them. He did not lead them. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. Now, I don't have the time to exegete for you exactly the details, the mechanics of what's going on here, except to say this. When it says in the evening, and then later when it talks about what Bathsheba was doing, when you put two and two together, you're looking at a man taking an afternoon nap. He's basically in the middle of the afternoon, while his troops are out in battle, he is there in his bed by himself taking a nap. He gets up from his nap and he begins to walk around on the roof of the palace. Understand something about how homes and palaces were built in that day. Many of those homes were what we called four-pillared homes, which means very simply that you had a living space underneath where most people would gather, but then you had four pillars that set up a second floor, if you will, and a roof over top of the house. And in the summertime and in the springtime, that is where most people spent their time. They spent their time on the roof. That's where they slept. That's where they bathed. That's where they entertained. That's where the large rooms were gathered. That's where the early church gathered, by the way. When it talks about the house churches in the early church, that's where they went. They went to the homes that were large enough to contain big groups, and they would go up onto the roof. Now, from the perspective of the roof, you could see different homes and different streets and different towns. You would have a bird's eye view, so to speak. But now the palace was even higher than that. So when you're on the palace roof, you're able to look down on top of the living arrangements of most of the homes. In other words, you want to talk about an invasion of privacy, there it is. You could see just about everything from the palace roof. There are some scholars, and oftentimes when you've watched a movie or you've seen some sort of depiction of this, you have this picture of Bathsheba being this temptress. You know, that she's caught David's eye, so to speak, and that this woman was coy and capable of luring him and enticing him. And I don't believe that's what happened here. In fact, I believe that when we come to the story of Bathsheba on the rooftop, she was doing what she was supposed to be doing in preparation for her husband, who was off to war, coming home for leave. She was doing what she should have been doing. And that is why I think the bulk of the story, when you read it closely, deals very little with what Bathsheba did. The focus of the story is on what David did. The great sin is David's sin. Now, that is not to say she is without culpability, because she is. But when the focus is on the sin is David's luring of this woman, his enticing, his using his power and his authority to get what he wanted. Verse 2 says, one evening, David got up from his bed, walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. When you read Josephus' account of this, it tells us that not only was she, Bathsheba, known for her great beauty, but her husband was known as a great warrior. In fact, the fact that their home was in proximity to the palace is similar to what we would call today living on the Beltway. She had close proximity. Her family had close proximity because of the political relationship between Uriah, her husband, and David. We know that for a fact because later on, David would try to get Uriah drunk. So David is entertaining Uriah. Now, not all soldiers got to be entertained by the king. So there had to be a close proximity of that home. They may have seen each other in the past. But now, when he's where he should not have been, at the opportune moment when she is doing what I believe she was supposed to be doing in preparing herself for her husband, this beautiful woman is seen taking the bath. In 2 Samuel chapters 8 through 10, God gives us an outline of some very impressive battles that David and his armies had fought. They show us his long career as the king of Israel. One by one, the enemies fall. One by one, the mighty hand of God deals with them through David's obedience. They even rise two at a time, and they're soundly defeated again. David's whipping the enemy forces two at a time. David was the giant killer with 20 years of experience and a track record of leadership. People would walk through brick walls to follow this man. He had an army of choice men, land of over 60,000 square miles, an undefeated battle ledger, a booming economy, a vast and developing infrastructure, a strong national defense, a great cabinet, lots of money, a cedar home with a great view, architectural drawings of a new, unparalleled sanctuary, and a clear moral mandate coming from God to lead. And what's he doing? He's standing on the balcony, lusting after a beautiful woman. You see, after the heat of war, usually the chill of winter sets in. And at least for David's army, it was a time to regroup. It was a time to clean up the wounds, take the bandages and bandage up the wounds and heal over the course of the winter in preparation for spring war. The Bible graphically tells us that it was spring, the time when military action against the Ammonites resumed. Joab and the armies went to war. David slept in. In fact, his eye was to be on the Ammonites, and instead his eye was on Bathsheba. Here is our first indication that David was about to fall. Little, I believe, did Bathsheba know what awaited her. In fact, from this story, we can draw a critical comparison to how you and I foolishly enter onto that slippery slope of moral failure, where we are where we should not be, doing what we should not be doing, failing to see the great victories God has given us, on alert on the heels of great spiritual victory, on alert as we prepare for great spiritual victory. When you read the accounts of Josephus, Bathsheba was known for being a very beautiful woman. But her husband, Uriah, was also known as a man of bravery and great strength. When I read Josephus' account of the actual battle that ended Uriah's life, he had basically been deserted. It was a plotted desertion. David had plotted a strategy where Uriah would go into battle, and he would take some of the choicest men with him, not knowing that when he handed these written orders over to the captain, to Joab, those written orders were his own death certificate. He would go into battle knowing that he was about to face the most incredible onslaught from the enemy at the most vulnerable place at the gate of the city. Many would die, and they knew it. What he didn't know was that when the gates were opened and the troops inside began to attack Uriah, that the orders that were given from David through Joab, those sealed orders that Uriah carried, told Joab that when the men come out, pull your troops back except for Uriah. We want Uriah to die. He doesn't tell Joab why he wants Uriah dead. But it's clear to Joab, Uriah is to die. The reason is because Bathsheba is now carrying David's baby. Talk about a soap opera. And when Uriah came home on leave, David basically said, take a few days. Go be with your wife. She's made all the preparations for you. Go sleep with her. She's your wife. You've been out in battle for a long time. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us this, and I'm only filling in what I believe are some subplots to the story that may or may not be true. I think Uriah was onto this. I think he knew something was wrong. I mean, after all, what man out in battle for as long as he was, coming home on leave, would not want to be with this beautiful woman? But he refused. He told David, he said, how can I go and enjoy the pleasures of my marriage when Joab and the other armies are out there, camped out there, they're in danger, my fellow soldiers are out there. I need to keep myself separated so that I'm not distracted by any of that because I'm a man of war. So what does David do? He brings him into his house. He said, let's have a drink or two. And he gets him drunk, hoping that in his drunken stupor, Uriah would then go and be with his wife. Why? Because there was a baby there. And he didn't want the responsibility of the baby. He wanted to be able to blame the child on Uriah. Nowhere in Scripture is polygamy acceptable. Nowhere does God call a relationship with a woman outside of marriage anything but adultery or fornication. Nowhere does God command him to do this. Yet God seems to be silent in condemning it. And so we look at that and we say, well, what's going on here? Was David really granted an exception that no one else was? Here is what God does not leave out. He does not leave out of the story the consequences of polygamy. You won't miss that anywhere. You won't miss that at all because the consequences of polygamy are very clear. Look at what happened with Jacob, and look at his 12 children and his several wives and the intermarriage that took place there. You have rape and incest and all kinds of horrible things. And in David's case, what you have as the result of this harem building is that God said through Nathan the prophet, the peace that you desire will never enter this house. You will always be a man of war. There seems to be no need to condemn the polygamy because the polygamous act condemns itself. And we see that in this case, David is about to bring a woman into his harem that in the social setting was more than permitted. And so he commands her to come. Can you imagine Bathsheba's thoughts when she knew that she was obligated to answer the summons of the king. Can you imagine what went through her mind? You see, David's task as king was to protect his citizens. He was now exposing one of his citizens to great moral failure. There's no indication that she knew why he summoned her. She has no idea. There's no indication that she has any idea why she's being summoned to see the king. Did it have something to do with Uriah? After all, he was a pretty important soldier in David's army. Why was he inviting me here? All of the depictions that we have of Bathsheba show her as this flirtatious woman who lured David into immorality, but the scriptures don't seem to tell us that. God chose to show us the horrible consequences of this act of polygamy. In this case, it involved the death of a baby. Later on, the betrayal of David by his own son Absalom. We see a picture unfolding of a dysfunctional family that made David a man of war for the rest of his life, and he never enjoyed one moment of peace. He would never see that great temple built because God had stripped from him that privilege. Yet he is referred to as a man after God's own heart. Oh, I do believe Bathsheba eventually had some culpability, but the Bible seems to pull us away from that and point us to the fact that she was merely obeying the authority structure over her. It's likely she had no choice.
Thank you for listening. For the complete sermon, please visit markinc.org and click In His Grip. Join Dr. Chuck F. Betters in the sanctuary from Monday to Thursday on the In His Grip podcast.